Hi everybody. I wanted to put together just a quick video talking about some basic strategies and Tales of Tribute, at least how it's playing out on the public test server. Full transparency up front, right? This is by beginners for beginners. I'm not any kind of a expert in collectible card games. I mean, I've played a little bit of Magic the Gathering and Hearthstone and Elder Scrolls Legends, but by no means am I a ranked player in any of those. So these tips will probably be obvious to anyone who has experience in this type of game. But for folks who are new to card games, hopefully this will give you some tips in terms of how to get started building your own strategies and your own play style as you go through the game. So let's talk first about early game. The first is a tip that is in, I think, all my videos so far, but you know, your first rounds consist of balancing two particular strategies. One is the removal of cards that you don't want from your deck or that are just kind of cluttering up your deck versus spending your gold to buy cards out of the tavern, right? So you get a limited amount of gold per turn, at most 5 in the first couple of turns, but you'll normally have a couple of cards, you know, depending on what decks are in play, that give you power instead. So you're going to make 4 or 5 gold per round at best in the first few rounds. Until you're allowed to kind of shuffle stuff in. So you're looking at, you know, you could probably buy a 4 or 5 value card if you get lucky. So your decision there has to be you know, is this a card that is in a deck that you want to play strategically? And B, are you in a situation where you're not just going to clutter up your deck? So the problem is if you spend all your gold buying cards from the tavern, you're really filling your deck. And you're not going, well, just probabilities, right, are going to say that you're not going to get good combos out of it because you're going to have these coins that you see here, these 1 value coins, these 1 gold suited cards are going to come up when you really need different cards to enter your hand. So it's you playing against a random number generator fundamentally. So you know, I would strongly advise against, unless, you know, it's just some really great draws on the tavern. You want to, at a minimum, balance out the purchases with the removal of cards from your deck using the Treasury Patron to convert these single value cards to 2 gold cards. That being said, you know, there can be situations where you just don't have a choice, right? So there have been games where we have drawn all, you know, 7, 8, and 9 value cards into the tavern, and that just makes for a slow burn game, and really all you can do is use the Treasury Patron to convert your cards until you build up enough gold to buy stuff out, or you get some sort of a removal technique to remove some cards out of the tavern. So that can be kind of a frustrating scenario to be in, but it certainly can happen. You know, some interesting things happen too, right? If neither of you favors a particular patron and all of a sudden your tavern is filled with cards from that patron, then you have a choice to make, right? You can play your own game, or you can strategically use card removal or buy into this deck that may not be your favorite one, right? So the point is, you know, make sure that you don't just clutter your deck up, because otherwise you're not only fighting your opponent, you're fighting the random number generator to get decent hands with decent combinations. Tacking onto that point, you probably want to focus on at most 2 suits, right? If you buy a bunch of cards from a bunch of different suits, then it's the same problem. You're littering your deck, and you're not going to be able to get effective combos from the deck colors. So focusing on 1 or 2, and really the decision between them is sort of dynamic, right? It depends on what shows up in the tavern. In terms of what you can buy. So randomness, again, feeds into the process in terms of saying, look, these are the cards that are showing up in the tavern. You can either choose, so like, for example, in the deck that's shown here, right, we could choose to go with you know, the Hlaalu cards that are shown. I already have 1 in play, so even though my original intent may have been to go, say, Crows and St. Pellin, I may choose to kind of dynamically go, you know, we have some good cards in play from the Hlaalu deck, maybe it makes sense to shift to that strategy. So the deck building component will always be dynamic, but limiting your purchases to 1 or 2 decks, again, will put you an advantage versus the random number generator in terms of getting favorable combinations in your hand. Number two, we're going to talk about is the patrons. So you kind of have to pay attention to them. So there's a number of things that can happen, right? You can lose by not paying attention to the patrons. If your opponent manages to flip all the patrons to favor them, that's a win condition for them. Two is, depending on which patrons you have in play, there can be some sort of passive effects going on. Either they could be making gold passively, they can be acquiring cards passively, they can be making power passively, they can be drawing cards passively, right? So the patrons all have all kinds of effects that can dramatically alter the state of the game. So you kind of need to pay attention to them. One of the things that was not obvious to me was if your opponent has two patrons favoring them and two are in the neutral state, you may think at that point that you're 2 turns away from them possibly being able to win with the patron victor, right? They'd have to flip 2 patrons, and you think you got a little bit of time to turn one of them back. Well, you may not, right? Because there are some cards that give you 2 patron interactions per turn. So just be aware, once your opponent has 2 patrons favoring them, if the other 2 are in neutral state, you may be within a single turn of losing if they have one of these cards come up that allows them to do 2 patron interactions at the same turn. I want to talk a little bit about the Duke of Crows. You're going to see this patron probably a lot when you start playing because it's one of the base game ones. It's really interesting, right? It converts gold to power. So the problem is once he favors you, you can't play him again until somebody else, your opponent, moves it back to neutral. So there's a couple things that can happen, right? You can get into this kind of back and forth power creep where you each convert all of your remaining gold to power. And that just becomes a foot race to 40 prestige. The other thing that you can do is if your opponent plays it, you can treat that as locked out. Again, you have to be cautious because it will now favor them. But, you know, at the end of the day, you could have the option to build gold in later turns and then just get a big hit at the end. So let's say you're able to get 12 or 14 gold in a turn. Using the Duke of Crows at that point would give you a huge prestige conversion. So use it strategically. Again, be cautious of the risk of leaving it in a favorite status for your opponent because there's a win condition with the 4 patrons favoring them. But by the same token, it's kind of nice to lock your opponent out once they've used it and just kind of leave it there so they're not able to convert any more gold to prestige, and then you get to pick when to use it. The third aspect here is tavern management, right? So there's a number of things that you kind of want to watch for other than just, hey, what cards can I buy? Can I afford to buy from the tavern that are strategic for me? You also kind of want to watch to see what your opponent is doing, right? So let's say your opponent is building a red St. Pellen deck and you see the Armory or Rally, which are very powerful red cards in play. If you have the option to buy it, to deny it from your opponent or to use some sort of another card to completely remove it from the game, then you can really kind of put your opponent at a disadvantage by denying them some very high-powered cards from their deck, right? So it's not just about what I can do, it's about what your opponent wants to do with those as well. Number 4, this power conversion, right, which is the mechanic where here on the screen you see, I have 29 power from this round, which is acquired just by playing cards that add to your power in exactly the same way that you would add gold as you play them. At the end of your round, any unused power gets converted to prestige, which is your score there in the middle, that 24 that I have right now. In general, I think it's best to just kind of allow that power to prestige conversion to happen at the end. What are your alternatives? So your alternatives are, 1, to remove your opponent's agents. They have the health number on them, so by expending power equal to their remaining health, you can remove their agents. Or 2, there are some patron interactions that allow you to spend power for different effects. One of them is you spend 2 power to draw a card. I'm not a huge fan of spending power to draw a card because my luck is such that I inevitably end up trading 2 power for 1 gold. So unless you're super confident that your next card is going to be better than, give you more effect than 2 power, I'd probably skip that conversion. So the exception is there are some red agents that if your opponent has in play will completely block your ability at the end of the turn to convert power to prestige. So you have got to remove those before the end of your turn. So if you had 10 power and that agent that's showing, then it makes sense to spend the 5 power. If there's no other way to remove that agent, like through a patron interaction or through some card that you play, then you kind of got to spend the power, because otherwise you're going to lose all 10 power. So just kind of watch for that. It's easy, when you're getting started, to not know that those agents can effectively block your conversion of power to prestige. 5 should be obvious, but again, as you're starting out, you got to know all the decks, right? Know what all the patrons do, know what type of deck it is, what are the abilities of the deck. So for example, here, that we see a 3 card in the tavern from the Red Eagle deck. Well, Red Eagle is primarily about forcing your opponent to discard cards and about removing cards from the tavern, right? So just kind of knowing what the abilities of each deck are. And in my separate introductory video, which is a little bit longer, I talk about in depth kind of each patron, what it does, and what the flavor of the deck is generally. So at least have some sense, because you may get forced into playing it, right? I mean, if your opponent takes all the red and purple cards and you wanted to play red and purple, then you sort of got to make do with what is available to you in the tavern, and knowing how to exploit each deck's strengths is going to be important to you. For number 6, I wanted to talk briefly about contract cards. So I think, as I mentioned in the introductory video, contract agents and contract actions are basically just like the regular cards, right? They behave more or less like regular agent and action cards, with the exception that they're instant. So when you buy them out of the tavern, they go into play immediately. It's a little bit difficult to say at this point how that's going to play into larger strategies, but the sense that I've gotten so far is that you might want to break your deck themes, if you will. So if you're playing, let's say, a purple and red, and there is a contract action or a contract agent available to you from the tavern, I'm not sure it's necessarily a bad thing to go ahead and play those, even if they're not in your deck. So the examples would be, like a card from Red Eagle, which allows you to, discard a card from the tavern, or dismiss one of your agents or your opponent's agents. So, and contract actions can do a lot of stuff, right? So there could be a contract action from the Hlaalu deck that would let you have 2 patron interactions. So I'm not sure it's the end of the world to play those straight out of the tavern when it's strategic for you to do so, even though I believe they do go into your discard pile and they get shuffled back in. I think some things that get removed are permanently removed from the game. Some of them go into your discard pile. So I think understanding that dynamic is important. But don't necessarily pass up contract cards just because they're not a part of your strategic deck. So for example, this, if I were playing, a blue purple deck, and this red contract agent came up. Well, that contract agent provides taunt, so it protects my other agents, and it also prevents my opponent from converting their power to prestige. So that could be very strategic to go ahead and play that, get it in play immediately, even if it's not strategic. And then, when you have to sacrifice a card later, then maybe you sacrifice the cards that are not part of your core deck. So make sure you understand the distinction between the contract cards and the regular cards, and keep your eye on everything that is in play in the tavern. And the last step is to sacrifice strategically. And this is more kind of for an end game situation. So for example, if you have the Hlaalu patron in play, its ability lets you sacrifice a card for prestige at an N-1 conversion, right? So if you convert a 6 gold card, you can get 5 prestige. At the end of the game, you're done with your cards, right? So if you're in a situation where you really want to kind of finish off your opponent completely, then this is the time when you want to look to if you have a good gold making set of cards in play and you're making a lot of gold per turn, then this is when you would save your Duke of Crows play for, assuming he's not already favoring you. So it's a good way to kind of close out your opponent. If you got 12 gold, that's an 11 power increment if you played Duke of Crows right then, on top of whatever else you made that round. So it can really significantly put you out of reach from your opponent. But the other is, if you're either want to, if you're pretty sure you're finishing your opponent in this turn, you haven't used your patron interaction yet, sacrificing one of your high value cards using the Hlaalu patron, again, can result in a 7, 8, 9 prestige difference, which is quite measurable, and can keep your opponent further away from you, because they have an entire turn after you cross 40 prestige to try to catch you. So if you're pretty certain you've got a good lead but you want to cement it, think about kind of this last play action to really get an overwhelming advantage if you can. So these have been some general starting strategies. If you have others, feel free to put them in the comments. Would love to hear other people's thoughts on this. And I think as more folks get into the game, we'll see some more sophisticated strategies emerge. And I'm looking forward to hearing what you guys have to say. Thanks.